Welcome into the Autzen Audibles podcast. I'm Matt Preem, Eric Scopel on the show as always. Welcome to your Monday edition, or maybe it's a Tuesday and you're checking this out a day late. Regardless, go to deckterritory.com for some full coverage of Oregon football, spring football. We've also got a ton of recruiting news from Jackson Moore. They landed a verbal commitment over the weekend, a legacy commit. Not Isaiah Molden. Josiah Molden committed to the Ducks, son of Alex Molden. That's where I was trying to go, and I almost called him Alex Isaiah for some reason. Big four-star commit, top player in the state of Oregon. Big news there. Men's basketball team's been on tear as well, landing a couple portal commitments. So make sure to go to deckterritory.com for your full recap of all of that. Plus, hey, look, there's still more. Baseball and softball coverage. John Evans and our intern Ian are doing a great job covering those sports as well. So we cover it all at duckterritory.com. Highly encourage you guys to check that out. But Eric, Saturday we got some time with Dan Lanning, early time, which is a rare occurrence. He showed up promptly on time, really maybe even a little earlier. And it was to recap the team's Saturday scrimmage inside Autzen Stadium. Rainy conditions on Saturday. They fought through the elements. He didn't really talk anything about that, which is probably a good thing because it meant probably nothing was really impacted there. But we got some broad comments about the first spring scrimmage, and we can kind of dive into what we think that means here on the show today.
Yeah, no details on who scored touchdowns, on a score, on even individual highlight plays. Mostly broad strokes. This is the Dan Lanning special in spring.
He doesn't like giving us that. So even if we asked, he would say no.
No, and I think I even kind of nudged him on hey, any young guys that stand out, and even was I know you're not going to tell me, but he was like, yeah, we're not going to get into any names. So no names makes it hard to really talk about a scrimmage, but. Here are some of the things that Dan really liked. He really liked the physicality was one of the first things he talked about walking in. This was their, first time really live tackle in a scrimmage game atmosphere this spring with this group of guys. And he thought that was a highlight. And I went back and looked at past years. A couple of years ago, first scrimmage, both in spring and fall, it was a big talking point of tackling not quite where we need it to be. We need to step that up. So the fact that they start with the first spring scrimmage, and it seems like it's in a good spot. That was encouraging, it sounded like. And then the two things I kind of focused my scrimmage recap on were the overall knowledge of the team, which followed a question Matt asked about, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then the fact that a bunch of young guys are starting to kind of look like they can play football. Dan kind of boiled it down. First scrimmages, who can tackle, who can catch the football, who can play football. And it sounds like there were some guys in their first scrimmage who really showed them and exhibited the ability to do that. So I know listeners would love to have more details. We would love to offer more details. A lot of this is just what Dan is telling us and kind of reading between the lines. But I think early returns first scrimmage seemed really positive. Also acknowledge that defense is usually ahead at this time of year. It sounded like some back and forth play, but defense probably was the better side on Saturday.
Yeah, there's a large number of newcomers on this roster, and the quote he said was, "I saw young guys out there who proved they can play at this level of football. When the meeting started today, I'm showing Nas Wyatt last year in the scrimmage what he did and what allowed us to say, okay, we need to find a way to get this guy on the field at times." I showed clips of Jordan Davidson doing that, and then I showed clips of Kenyon Sadiq and said, this guy's not here anymore. Who's going to replace that? Those are the things I need to see today. I think some guys really stepped up. And that's a notable quote because, like you said, Eric, we don't know necessarily who he's directly talking about, but we know across the board on both sides of the football, young guys, whether they're a first-year player at Oregon, whether because they came in from the transfer portal, or they're maybe like a redshirt freshman or a redshirt sophomore who's maybe got a handful of games under his belt in his first 2 seasons at Oregon, they have to play. And if they don't, or if they play and they can't be effective, Oregon's going to be in trouble. And they are going to be leaning on some younger players to the program. And those guys need to be ready to step up, whether it's backup linebacker or whether it's the second group of your defensive line. Maybe it's your tight end rotation behind Jamari Johnson. There's a long list of positions that we could go through. that newcomer / young guy is going to have to step up and be ready for the prime time.
Yeah, and this is just early kind of signs of some of that. And I really wish we had some names. I think one of the other thing that stood out, Matt, was the knowledge base part. And that was in response to a question that you asked. And then he reiterated that later, I think, to a question Ryan from the Oregonian kind of asked about the offense and defense being ahead. And just it sounds like, and it makes sense when you think back to last year, because he specifically mentioned he thought they were ahead from a knowledge base this time last year, as opposed to this. I should say that they were ahead on Saturday from where they were a year ago. And you think back to last year's team and how many younger players being thrust into new spots, and just like Matt was talking about with this scrimmage, where there's a bunch of newness, a lot of new faces. The difference is this year they do have 13, 14 guys who've been kind of full-time starters either last year or the year before, when you consider Evan. And it sounds like maybe getting through a scrimmage where you're running through the playbook and you're doing it without the type of breaks maybe you're getting previously in practice. It sounds like kind of all of the operational things were like thumbs up. Like this was a positive start of like people know where they're supposed to be. They're doing the things that they're being asked to do. And not that that's like a huge bar to clear, but first scrimmages, maybe that was a harder thing last year. So it feels like maybe they're a little bit ahead of schedule right now from past expectations. I think that's encouraging, and also kind of highlights maybe Dante, Poncho, some of these veterans on offense, especially just being a little bit more comfortable with where they're at, because this is year one in entering a spot. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And again, I know fans want to hear who had the touchdowns, who made the big plays, and I wish we had that to share. But broadly speaking, it does sound like a day where everything kind of was operationally and at a pretty good spot, and some of the younger players showed up. And because I also thought it was notable, Dan said, like, what are some of the areas they needed to improve on? He said they had 6 penalties, which isn't a huge number when you consider you're tallying both sides of the ball, but also like a lot of the things with the staff, which I thought was notable. It almost seemed like he was a little more critical of how the staff has a new defensive coordinator, new offensive coordinator, a couple of new position coaches being elevated to new roles. Didn't really get into too many details of like what was going on there, but it almost felt like he was a little more nitpicky about the staff's approach to the scrimmage as opposed to the players, which I think if you're listening, you probably, I took that as a real positive of like, hey, these guys who are at least playing are in a really good spot today.
Yeah, the staff one is an interesting dynamic, and I hadn't, to be honest with you, I'm a little disappointed. I hadn't thought of this question of just, hey, new operation with play callers, new operation with guys down below on the sideline in terms of relaying the information up above, or vice versa, how that goes. And that's something we'll want to talk to Lanning about on this Saturday. They will scrimmage again on this coming Saturday, and just get that operation, because it is new people. People are in new spots, relaying plays, diagnosing plays, calling plays. I'm sure with the scrimmage, it wasn't totally freehand. They probably had a lot of, hey, we've got it scripted so we get this look. We want to be guaranteed to see this look, whether it's offense or defense, and see how our guys react to it. But nonetheless, how that operation is moving along, that's a good point, and that's something that we'll want to follow up on. Let's transition over to, unless do you have anything left from Saturday scrimmage notes?
Because we're not going to talk Joe Lorig, Dan did say a couple long field goals made on Saturday. Didn't get into who made those, but encouraging considering all the turnover on special teams. That sounded like it was a pretty good special teams day too.
Correct. All right, let's move to maybe the big name from a player perspective that spoke on Saturday, and that's a guy that we've been waiting to talk to for a long time, and that was Evan Stewart, Oregon senior receiver. Obviously missed all of last season due to injury, missed the Rose Bowl due to injury, 2 different injuries, by the way, and really just kind of put his life on hold. And Eric, you and I talked about how he's perceived, and I don't know if it's necessarily like he's misunderstood, but I walked away. It was like a 16-minute interview with Evan Stewart with about 10 media members. And it was honestly the best we've ever seen him talk. He was very well spoken. He was very to the point about what he wants to say. And he was quite honestly honest. Like, he didn't avoid questions. He was very forthcoming on injury stuff. He didn't shy away from things. And I walked away thinking, like, man, this was a guy that I went in thinking he's kind of got that prima donna, big play receiver aura that goes about that type of position and that star. And very much not. He's almost misunderstood. Like, feels very much like a team culture, team, everyone loves the guy. And he's really bought into this program. He talked a lot about, I want to do anything I can for the Oregon Ducks. I'm trying to take care of myself and, get this team to a championship. It was, everything started with, I want to do what I can do my best to help the team.
No, I agree. And I think part of it is the position he plays and the 5-star status, like those things right there. I think people had probably similar misconceptions about like DeCorian as a former 5-star number 1 overall receiver prospect. You do think back to, like, I don't know, a Terrell Owens or Randy Moss wasn't necessarily as much what he would say, maybe as much of the stuff that happened off the field. And these are some of my favorite and some of the best receivers of all time. But, and there are many other examples we could come up with of big time receiver talents who maybe don't carry themselves the way you would, I don't want to say want to see, but maybe expect to see from somebody who's so valuable to the team, where it does feel like there's a little bit of a me to it. And Evan was clear of, like, a big part of this year, this is a do or die year for himself. I thought that was notable. And again, to your point, Matt, about just like being to the point and honest, like I thought Evan conveyed his story like a very, very accurately. Didn't hang his head when he went down, was disappointed, took a lot away from that year from playing football, tried to be Dante Moore's kind of support system from the sideline when things weren't going very well, tried to be somebody who was kind of mentoring the receivers, wanted, going back to the injury itself, was shocked that it had happened. Took him, he admitted it took a couple of days to kind of come to terms with the fact that, like, I just suffered a serious injury, and I
didn't believe it at first.
Yeah, didn't believe it at first, and had to take some time to kind of come to terms with it. And the year itself, like, he said there was no low points as much as he was just trying to stay positive about everything. And now he's here. And I asked him a question about Coach Maringer's comments last month, where Maringer was like, "Hey, this guy is as dialed in, as focused as I've ever seen him." And like I said a moment ago, Evan's response was like, "Yeah, this is do or die. This is my year to prove that I am both not only to the public, but also to myself, that I can be this player, this elite receiver that I've been, expected to be for my entire career." And it's been like kind of an up and down career for Evan, both at A&M and at Oregon. A lot of moments where you think back to that Ohio State game 2 years ago and the plays Evan made in that win. And Oregon probably doesn't win that game without those two opportunities to get behind the defense downfield, one for a touchdown, the one for a big play that set up points. And, that kind of high, there's those highs, but then there was a bunch of games in between where he wasn't very productive. So he knows what's on the line this year. And I'm with you, Matt. I was really impressed with kind of the way he told his story. And I would encourage listeners who maybe aren't fans or maybe have, like I said, kind of maybe a misconception about who this guy is. I think it's worth checking it out. And it also reminds me and makes me kind of excited to talk to Dylan Raiola, which I believe we're getting at some point this week. Because I feel like there's also similar misconceptions about him, and maybe we'll come away from that feeling differently. But this could be maybe a good cautionary tale. Like, don't judge the star ranking. Don't judge the position or kind of the social media persona with both of these guys. So I'll be curious to hear from Dylan as well when we get a chance to talk to him. That's another person that comes from another school where the previous school probably doesn't think very highly of him.
Ross Douglas also gave us some good insight into the Oregon receiver room. He spoke with the media also on Saturday. We'll have more from his conversation up on deckterritory.com now, today and later on this week. But he gave us some good insight too about just Evan Stewart and what Oregon is seeing out of him on the football field. Obviously, Evan Stewart was like, "I'm in desperation mode," or maybe that's the quote that Ross Douglas gave. He said that he's playing as a desperate football player. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but and that goes in line with what Drew Maringer talked about of this is the best that he's ever seen. He called him Stewie within the Oregon program. And Douglas is like he's a cut for the NFL, and I thought we got a lot of insight there from him of just kind of how he's trying to help and critique and prep and prepare Evan Stewart, A, for a successful senior season, but B, to also get him ready for the league, which, remember, people, he was being viewed as a first-round draft pick towards the end of the 2024 season before he got hurt. And there was a real likelihood that he could have gone pro if he didn't get hurt. Like, let's say for some reason he doesn't get hurt leading up to the Rose Bowl, and that outcome is somehow different. Well, I don't think his return would have changed it, but that outcome is different, and Oregon wins that game against Ohio State in the Rose Bowl. I don't think Evan Stewart's on this team right now at Oregon. I think he's in the NFL. Like, that's how real that possibility was. This is a guy that's got NFL aspirations, and Douglas is trying to do everything he can to get him there.
Well, and right on that same topic, I thought Evan's comments about Dante and his relationship and just being kind of, I thought pretty frank of like, if Dante wasn't on this roster, I don't know if I would be, was again, paraphrasing, but that was essentially what he was communicating, was just the value of like, hey, these guys have gotten really close. He talked about that. They go to church together. They're texting. They breakfast together every morning. They're constantly each other's ear, constantly talking about football and kind of how to get better. But also, I think for both of them, 2025 was supposed to be maybe their final seasons for both of them at Oregon, and also seasons where they thrived together, and none of that happened. And now they're looking at it this year as like, this is Evan and Dante's time, right? Like this is the opportunity, to your point, Matt, of that desperation. Well, if you're going to hitch your wagon to anybody, Dante Moore is a pretty good wagon to hitch it to. And it's pretty clear those two are working really hard to develop that kind of chemistry and to kind of work out any possible kinks, because 2025, Stewart mentioned multiple times that he was just blown away by Dante Moore's arm talent and the type of things he was doing in practice. And he was really excited by the opportunity to play with them. And then unfortunately, summer workouts, things changed. So, I think I'm more encouraged and excited about what Evan Stewart can be this year than I was going into these interviews. I will be curious to see what it looks like in the spring game. He acknowledged like he doesn't think he's at 100. It was a weird quote, Matt. What did you make of? I don't think I'm at 100%, but I think I'm better than I was before. It was kind of like, well,
can't be both. Like, what's going on here? Like,
yeah, I thought that was interesting. But either way, I don't know, Matt. My curiosity of like, is Evan somebody you can rely on to be a big producer at this position, which is a pre-spring kind of theory, totally out the window. I feel really good about him. We're going to talk to DeCorian at some point. I'm curious to hear kind of some of his thoughts. We did speak with Jeremiah McClellan. We have maybe some quotes we want to go over from that interview last Thursday. But those three in particular, I'm now pretty bought in on. That's going to be Oregon's primary receiving group. Not that that's like breaking any news. Listeners are probably going like, yeah, no shit, Eric. Like, that's pretty obvious stuff. But you wonder just with Evan where he was kind of at. And I'm so encouraged by hearing from so many of his teammates, his coaches, of just like, he's attacking this the right way. He looks good. Again, the spring game is going to be kind of crossing off that list of like, okay, now with our own eyes, we can say he looks pretty close to being where he was before. And this kind of leads me to another thing, Matt, that I wanted to talk about, which was Coach Douglas was pretty upfront of like, it's positionless football at receiver for me, which I know that drew some criticism online of like, how can it be positionless, blah, blah, blah. But of just like, they're going to approach this of very similar to like how we hear Leak Terry talk about the O-line, where it's like, let's find the best five guys.
Yeah.
I think that's the approach at receiver. And if for my money, they're pretty clear who the best three guys are. Sorry, Iverson Hooks. I think you're going to be involved in this offense, but I'm buying the fact that they can play Evan, Jeremiah, and DeCorian, and that ultimately probably will be what they try to do. And we can talk about some of these guys' past experiences in the slot, but Douglas's comments certainly illustrated like, no, we're going to find the best guys and maximize them on the field this fall.
And I think that's the right move to make. And maybe it forces some guys to get a little out of their comfort zone to expand on their games to make them better in the long run too. I mean, Evan Stewart talked about it. I was like, I haven't really played a ton of football at the collegiate level in the slot. He said Jeremiah McClellan certainly did that his first year at Oregon when he was redshirting. He was behind Tez. He was working in that position. Corey Mori, Evan Stewart also mentioned he's got the ability to do it. We've seen him do it in games a little bit. But those are, I think you're right. I think those are your cutting shoulders ahead above everybody else, your three best receivers. Iverson Hooks can maybe get himself into that conversation a little bit. And I also think Oregon's offense is just going to look different from what it did last year in terms of where they're deploying players on the field and then what type of formations they're running in. They don't have the same type of two-headed monster attack, at least right now that we know of at tight end, like they did last year with Sadiq and Jamari Johnson.
Right.
Johnson's the one that's still here. But perhaps Oregon's talent and depth at receiver, we see more four-set receivers, or maybe we see a lot of three-set receivers. And we don't see a lot of double tight end. We don't see a lot of 22. And instead, it's not as much of a run game offense. It's a pass game offense, which in turn opens up everything for the slot to not really have the requirements that you would need in there from a run game perspective. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see play out. And I'm the belief of you play your best players, and if your best players are all kind of the same type of guy, so be it. But on the flip side, Eric, we kind of talked about this at the portal season of they don't have a lot of those big-bodied receivers on this roster that hopefully they would go get one. They never really did. And now we're going to see what that means in terms of roster construction and scheme construction.
Yeah, here's Ross Douglas's quote, which apparently Ross Douglas, Matt Preem, very similar opinions on wide receivers and how they want to be utilized in Oregon's offense.
I was the same.
Very similar people. It's really positionless football here in my room. When I evaluate receivers, I evaluate skill sets. But if you're a good football player, you should be able to play anything, whether you're outside or whether you're in the slot. You should be able to be plug and play anywhere. So that's the operational kind of understanding we've now got. And I think we kind of understood that to a certain extent coming in. It just wasn't explicitly said. And then here's the snap. I just put these out. Like here are the snap percentages in the slot for these three guys. McClellan played 25% of his slots in the snaps in the slot last year. DeCorian was 16 and Evan was 13.9 back in 2024. So these guys have been 75% or more, in some cases in the 80s on the outside. I think we're going to see that shift this year. Iverson Hooks is a point of interest for me because this is a guy who at UAB last year had like 930 yards, 63% of those snaps came inside in the slot. So he was a traditional full-time slot receiver. I think it's going to be interesting to see come fall. And this might be something we're looking at like week to week of kind of, hey, who's playing on the outside, who's playing in the slot. That might be like kind of a thing we're just checking in on all the time. But, if they want to play somebody who has history there, Hooks checks that box. But I really like these three receivers, and Douglas talked about it. Evan talked about it. Their skill sets kind of complement each other. Like, even though, to your point, Matt, they're all basically 5'11" to 6 foot in size, and they're all, 185 to 210 pounds or so in weight. Like, their body type wise, they are pretty similar. They do have really, I think, very different skill sets, and the speed that you see from both Moore and Stewart is different than McClellan. McClellan's ability I think McClellan and Moore in particular have some really impressive like contested catch ability. We know what McClellan can do. Like, that's kind of become his calling card. The run after the catch stuff you see from Moore and Stewart stands out. Like, you just look at these guys and go, I'm intrigued to see who ends up being in the slot the most, because I think there's reasons they can all thrive there with what you try to accomplish there. And it's going to be just interesting to see kind of how this settles in come fall. And like I said a moment ago, I think we're going to be tracking all season, like who's working where the most and kind of how this is coming together. But I don't know. This receiving core has a lot of reasons to be excited about it. And certainly they have the right trigger man to get the most out of this offense this year.
do we want to pivot to special teams?
Well, I did want to hit Jeremiah McClellan saying he'd rather die than drop a football, which was
quite the comment.
That's pretty telling. There was a lot of talk. Apparently, a lot of people talk about death this week. Someone posted it on social media because I wrote 2 stories. One which Jeremiah says, "I'd rather I'd rather die than drop the football," and the other one where Evan's like, "It's a do or die season." A lot of talk about dying in the wide receiver room in a couple of days, more than people needed to hear, probably.
I will just have to remind people it's figure of speech, and
sure, yes, it is
how much that they really want to be successful at Oregon. But yeah, I mean, but honestly, like, his play, Jeremiah McClellan's play reflects that. Like, he somehow every single game, it sounds like daily in practice, is able to pull off something where it almost comes to a point where, my words, not theirs, it feels like they're almost numb to it now in terms of seeing, ridiculously catch after ridiculous catch, just because he's so proficient at it.
Yeah, and he also acknowledged, probably like all of us, he's went back and watched that Washington catch no catch hundreds of times, and if you're somebody like Kim, who obviously catching a football means a lot to him based upon these comments, he does it for those things those moments on Saturday where he just creates highlight reel catches, and I'm frankly so excited to see him again this fall and some of the grabs he can make and the impact those catches can have on games, because I think he may be like, I've been going through my head since he made those comments of like the best catchers the football Oregon has had. It's not a super long list of guys that have awesome catches and the ability, like, where that's kind of like the focal point. Like, you think back to Oregon receivers, it's kind of always been either you get guys who win over the top with speed, and those are usually pretty much uncontested catches, or guys that are in the slot or in the screen game really valuable. Like, there have not been a ton of guys where you go like, man, you throw the ball up to that guy, he's gonna go get it every time. I think Jeremiah is going to be one of those guys, and when he's around 2 players that can win with their speed and their explosiveness, to the point that we're making before, there's just a lot of reason to be excited about what these 3 guys could look like together, along with a Jamar Johnson, along with some of the other players in the pass game.
Yeah, he's got an opportunity to, you're right, leave his Oregon career whenever that would be. Hopefully, for Oregon's sake, that's in 2 or 3 more years, or I guess 2 more years, because that would mean he would have a junior year and a senior year for the Ducks. Mm-hmm. But he's got an opportunity to, like your point, leave as maybe the most memorable pass catching player at Oregon, or at least in recent memory.
Strictly catching the football.
Yes. Strictly catching the football, the skill of catching the football, and the ridiculousness of the difficulty levels that he's able to accomplish. I mean, Dante Moore was saying he even does it in the airport, which is hilarious.
Which is, videos of him waiting for his flight and working on catching a football in the airport. Yeah. Unique guy. And really, just like Evan, and if you haven't, I would just like implore everybody, just go watch these interviews. They're really fun, and a lot of these guys are very likable. I think one of the things that really stood out about Evan and Jeremiah, kind of said every answer with a smile on their face. Like, these are pretty jovial, upbeat, animated guys, and I think pretty easy people to root for. Yeah. How much do you think listeners care about Joe Lorig and special teams thoughts? How much do we want to get into that?
I just think real quick we talk about his overarching theme of special teams, not necessarily by position. Or at least every position. I think the biggest one that we need to talk about is the place kicker. It's the one that people are going to be associated the most with. They're going to know the most. It's the one that probably generates the most. Unfortunately, from a player perspective, like, that's the one people can gravitate the most and acknowledge when they're playing well, and then B, unfortunately for them, when they're not playing well, just because it's a missed kick or a made kick. That's pretty simple. There is competition there. It sounds like they do got options. You can give us kind of just a quick rundown of just what's playing out right now at the place kicker position.
Yeah, we got Gage Hurich back. Oregon fans know him. He kicked about. It was weird. Joe Lorig said he had 31 extra points, and I got him at 16 on the official stats. So I don't know if he was confused or something. But regardless, somebody you've seen a little bit. He kicked a long field goal last year against Rutgers, missed it. Kicked a 50-plus yard field goal in the spring game last year, hit it. So this is a guy they've been working to groom for the last couple of years. He'll be a redshirt sophomore this year. And somebody that, frankly, like, best case scenario here, you've got, a multi-year starter, similar to an Atticus, similar to a Camden. And, Joe was really upbeat about what they've seen from him. He also acknowledged, like, until you get him, in front of the bright lights and it's not, mop up duty extra points, but it's big moment kicks, you kind of don't know what you have. But he was really high also on kind of the mental side of things with him. But that's the returner that they're excited about. Keaton Emmett came from Nevada, another in-state kid. I believe he went to Jesuit originally. Primarily, he was at Western Oregon, then he went to Nevada, primarily kickoff specialist, not place kicking. And then Rocco Graziano, I believe that's a Sheldon kid.
Yes.
Who he mentioned was just a really good athlete, could kick the ball a mile. He's now getting to the point where he's got more accuracy. So those are kind of the three names. And really just coming out of that conversation, it feels like this is Gage's job to lose. But he did say Saturday scrimmage, we had this interview on Thursday with Coach Lorig, which can be really important for kind of just like taking stock of where this is at. And Coach Lanning said afterwards that a couple of guys kicked and successfully made long field goals. Didn't give us names, but that gives us a sense that, there's some positive developments there. And then I won't go into all the names, but I will also, and you can read this over on the site, we've got a full breakdown of the special teams. Very, very, very popular story about special teams over there. Also have to find a new long snapper. Also have to find a new punter, new punt returner, new kick returners. There's a lot to replace. It's kind of every single position on special teams is kind of up for grabs right now, and not, and without a returning starter, it's going to be really interesting to see how that looks. And I think that'll be one of the things in the spring game that obviously it's not going to be top of mind, but it will be interesting just to see who's successful there, who looks good, and kind of who's maybe pulling away in some of those competitions, because special teams in 2026 are going to look an awful lot different than they did in 25.
Yeah, you are going to see a handful of newcomers across the board. And I really encourage you guys, go watch the Joe Lorig interview. It's pretty wild how in-depth and in detail he gets. And I guess my last parting thoughts is, at Oregon, special teams matter. And Joe Lorig, he says this every year, but every year he goes a little bit more into detail or shares just a tiny little bit different nugget about it. He notes, like, hey, the offensive coordinator doesn't usually sit in on special teams meetings. Defensive coordinator is not here doing that. At Oregon, it's different. And he said he only was going to come to Oregon, and basically the reason he did was just because he knew Dan Lanning and his upbringing and his coaching arc, and knowing Dan, that he was going to treat special teams equally as important as every other unit. And I think that's been reflective at Oregon the last couple of seasons. And that, look at how frustrating special teams was under Mario Cristobal, and the lack of mistakes and the lack of execution that you have. And while they certainly aren't perfect under Joe Lorig, it's hard to get to perfect. It's almost impossible. They are starkly better across the board. And I think that's because of the commitment that he gets from his head coach, Dan Lanning.
2022 was a rough start for special teams. You think back to that game against Oregon State. I think it's gotten progressively better. And last year, I thought they were pretty outstanding. If you go back and look at the success they had eliminating opposing teams' punt and kick returns, the success of Atticus Sappington becoming a guy who could hit game winners reliably and just be a consistent, hey, it's a 39-yard field goal, which sounds like a really low bar to clear. But at Oregon, it hasn't always been cleared. But like, there's a 39-yard kick. This guy's going to make it regardless of if it's the first couple minutes of the game on the first drive or late in the game, maybe to put your team ahead. And then Luke Basso, people don't really prioritize long snapping. They don't really talk about it at all. But this was the Big Ten all conference first team pick the last 2 years, a guy who will probably be an NFL long snapper. He's, I think, rated, or at least was earlier this offseason, as the top long snapper in the 2026 NFL draft. So Oregon had a lot of really talented players, and I thought they were very proficient on special teams in 25. 26 is going to require so many changes in terms of the personnel, and it's just going to be interesting to see how that comes together, because I think the bar is set pretty high based upon where it was at last year. No, it wasn't perfect. Certainly, you'd like to see more explosive returns, but as Joe said, our primary focus is own ball and get down, basically. No penalties and own the football are the goals on returns. And I know that runs counter to fans who want to see the long returns and everything, but they're going to put the reliable guys back there who are going to make the right plays. And that's the goal. So all in all, I'm with you. I think special teams have been significantly improved over the last 3 or 4 seasons under Coach Lanning and Joe Lorig.
All right, that's going to do it for us here on this edition of the Autzen Audibles podcast. A couple things to try and look forward to the next couple episodes that we're going to play out. We're going to work with Jackson Moore to get him on to dive into some recruiting features on the site, on the podcast as well. Duck's been doing well in the recruiting world, and we need to get him on to get you up to speed on what's going on from a recruiting football perspective. And then we're approaching a point where we're probably going to need to dive into just kind of like a temperature check for the men's and women's basketball programs.
Yeah.
Transfer portal, both are trying to be active. Obviously, the men are more active right now, but it's because they have more spots to fill. They had like 14 of 15 scholarships that needed to get filled. They've landed a couple commitments. I should say 3. More could be coming, so we'll need to dive into that as well. And then we've also got the usual suspects of spring football trickling in and out this week with a spring scrimmage set for Saturday. And believe it or not, Eric, we are 2 weeks away from the spring game, which is pretty wild to think about. But nonetheless, that's also coming up on the horizon. So a lot to look forward to here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. But until then, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.